The morning heat had barely begun to rise over Dakar when a shockwave rippled through international news networks. Yet another African nation had officially announced the cancellation of a long-standing military and administrative cooperation agreement with France. The statement, broadcast live from the presidential palace, was firm, unapologetic, and symbolic of a new era unfolding across the continent. For decades, France had been deeply entrenched in African political structures, military agreements, economic partnerships, and a network of influence that seemed unshakable. But the tide was turning, and the signs had been visible for years. Now that quiet rumbling had erupted into a loud declaration of sovereignty. Across cities like Bamako, Niamey, Ouagadougou, and Conakry, crowds filled public squares, waving national flags and chanting calls for complete independence. Independence from foreign control, from political dependency, from the remnants of colonial-era arrangements. Their voices rose with pride, frustration, and determination. They were not merely protesting. They were defining a new future. Young people, energized by social media movements and inspired by recent political changes, felt more united than ever. For them, this was not just a diplomatic move, it was a generational victory. In the background of this rising movement, African leaders were increasingly vocal about the need for equal partnerships, not hierarchical relationships. Many had criticized France for years, accusing it of interference, resource exploitation, and political favoritism. Today's announcement served as a powerful message to Paris. Africa was no longer willing to be treated as a subordinate sphere of influence. Inside the Élysée Palace in France, anxiety simmered. Reports from ambassadors and intelligence agencies painted a concerning picture. France was rapidly losing leverage across regions where it once dictated the narrative. Advisors rushed through hallways with files, updates, and emergency assessments. Some whispered that the latest withdrawal might trigger resignations within the French government, while others insisted that maintaining influence was still possible if France radically changed its approach. Meanwhile, African governments were exploring new alliances. Negotiations with China, Russia, Turkey, and India gained momentum. Many nations signaled willingness to open their markets, security sectors, and technology industries to partners offering respect rather than dominance. The shift was unmistakable. Africa was no longer waiting for permission. It was choosing its path. And as the morning sun reached its peak over Dakar, the significance of the announcement became undeniable. The balance of global power was shifting, and Africa was stepping into a new chapter with strength and clarity. The news hit Paris like a sudden storm. By mid-afternoon, every major French newspaper had splashed dramatic headlines across their front pages. Africa turns away, government in crisis, foreign policy failure. Pressure mounts on Paris. Talk shows erupted into loud debates. Analysts argued fiercely about who was to blame, and political commentators predicted that a major government shake-up was inevitable. What had once been unthinkable was now being openly discussed. The resignation of top officials. Inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the atmosphere was tense and electric. Diplomats, advisors, and senior analysts crowded around long conference tables, flipping through documents, maps, and intelligence briefs. The foreign minister, usually composed and calm, seemed visibly shaken. "We underestimated the scale of this shift," he admitted reluctantly, tapping his fingers anxiously on the polished wood surface. "This is not one country acting alone. This is a regional movement." A heated argument broke out. One advisor insisted France should send diplomatic envoys immediately to repair relations. Another argued this approach would look desperate. A young analyst, brave enough to speak against senior voices, stood up and said firmly, "We are dealing with a new Africa, confident, self-defined, and tired of our outdated policies. We must reset everything." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Meanwhile, in the Élysée Palace, the president held back-to-back emergency meetings with his inner circle. The pressure was immense. Opposition leaders accused him of losing France's global standing. Allies urged him to remain calm. even as his political base demanded a clear and decisive response. The question of resignation, rumored across media outlets, was never spoken directly in the room, yet it lingered like a shadow behind every conversation. Outside, Parisian streets were buzzing. People gathered in small groups near cafes, discussing the breaking news. Protesters soon arrived outside the National Assembly, carrying signs demanding transparency, accountability, and a new foreign policy approach. Some blamed the government for clinging too tightly to old colonial ties. Others believed France had acted too passively in recent years. But all agreed that the situation was spiraling faster than anyone expected. By evening, the city felt heavier than usual. The Eiffel Tower glowed in the night. Tourists continued their strolls, but beneath the surface, a sense of political uncertainty pulsed through the capital. France was facing a moment of reckoning, a crisis not of military defeat but of diplomatic identity. The world was changing, and Paris, for the first time in decades, found itself struggling to catch up. While France grappled with upheaval across Africa, an equally surprising geopolitical shift was unfolding in the Caucasus. Armenia, a nation long tethered to Russia through history, security agreements and shared interests, was quietly taking steps toward closer cooperation with Ukraine. At first, it was subtle: cultural exchanges, student programs, and humanitarian aid missions that drew little attention outside regional news. But beneath the surface, these initial gestures marked a profound strategic pivot. The real signals became evident when high-ranking Armenian officials visited Kyiv for what were officially described as economic and diplomatic discussions. The media in both countries framed the meetings as pragmatic. Yet the implications were unmistakable. Armenia was exploring a new alignment, one that could balance its traditional ties with Moscow while opening doors to Europe and Ukraine. Analysts across the globe took notice. For many, it was unthinkable. Armenia had rarely challenged Russian influence so openly. Inside Yerevan, the government defended the shift with careful, deliberate language. Prime Minister and foreign ministers stressed that Armenia's actions were rooted in national security, economic opportunity, and sovereignty. We will choose partners based on the interests of Armenia and our people, one official declared at a press conference, not based on outdated obligations or external pressure. This message resonated strongly at home, where citizens debated the benefits of diversification versus the risks of upsetting long-standing allies. In Kyiv, officials welcomed the Armenian outreach as both symbolic and practical. Ukraine saw strategic value in cultivating a partner in the Caucasus, geographically close, historically cautious, and willing to explore cooperation in trade, energy, and security. Discussions about transport corridors, joint infrastructure projects, and defense collaboration hinted at a deeper, longer-term commitment. Meanwhile, Moscow reacted with immediate concern. Russian state media criticized Armenia's moves, calling them provocative and a betrayal of friendship. Analysts in Moscow warned that this pivot could disrupt regional balance, complicate security arrangements, and strain political alliances. Yet in Yerevan, diplomats remained calm, emphasizing dialogue and strategic autonomy. On the streets of Yerevan, the mood was cautiously optimistic. Citizens understood that this diplomatic turn carried risks, but also offered hope for greater independence, economic development, and a more balanced foreign policy. Young Armenians in particular saw it as a step toward integration with broader European and global systems, while older generations weighed the historical implications carefully. By the end of the week, the signal was clear. Armenia was charting a new course. It was a calculated, bold, and deliberate decision, one that not only surprised the international community, but also, by the end of the year, the global landscape was shifting in ways few could have predicted. Africa had begun asserting its independence from France with a wave of decisive, unapologetic moves. Armenia had taken a bold step toward Ukraine, signaling a reorientation of alliances in a historically delicate region. And France, once confident in its influence abroad, was forced to confront a reality it could no longer ignore. In Paris, the political class moved cautiously. Analysts described the events as a tectonic shift in global power dynamics, one that could redraw relationships, trade agreements, and military partnerships across multiple continents. The president, addressing the nation in a rare televised statement, acknowledged the changing world. We must adapt. We must embrace partnerships based on equality, respect, and mutual benefit. The world is evolving, and so must France. The statement was measured, yet it carried the weight of undeniable transformation. Across Africa, governments celebrated their new autonomy. Diplomatic ties with new partners, China, Russia, Turkey, and India, were being formalized, signaling the dawn of a multipolar era where Africa would no longer be confined to the shadow of old colonial powers. Citizens in cities from Dakar to Kinshasa took pride in their nation's growing agency, while youth movements harnessed social media to amplify their message of self-determination. The continent, long a stage for external interests, was now an actor in its own right. In the Caucasus, Armenia's pivot toward Ukraine was equally symbolic. Meetings between the two nations emphasized economic cooperation, energy partnerships, and cultural exchanges, signaling that geography, history, and past allegiances no longer dictated policy. For Ukraine, the Armenian overture represented a strategic foothold in a region traditionally dominated by Russian influence. For Armenia, it marked a step toward securing its sovereignty and diversifying its international relationships. Meanwhile, global markets and foreign ministries watched carefully, adjusting strategies and recalibrating alliances. The events created ripple effects, from trade negotiations in Brussels to military planning in Moscow, forcing nations to rethink long-held assumptions about loyalty, influence, and regional dominance. By the time the year closed, the message was unmistakable. The old order was fading, and a new one was emerging. Africa was claiming its voice. Armenia was redefining its position. France and other global powers had to learn to negotiate with equals, not subjects. And the world, more interconnected and unpredictable than ever, was entering a period of profound transformation. In the end, the upheavals of the year illustrated one enduring truth. Global politics is never static, and those who fail to adapt are destined to be left behind. The stage had been set for a new chapter, bold, uncertain, and charged with the promise of nations forging.